Welcome to the JD Power Insurance Intelligence Podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today, we've got the JD Power Insurance Practice team. So that includes Steve Crewdson. Steve, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Breanne Armstrong. Breanne, welcome. And Mark Garrett. So Mark, thanks for joining us today. Hey, so before we do have a topic for today, we're going to dive into. Before we get to that, we just wanted to touch on some recent news. One of the big news items for the past couple weeks was an unexpected earthquake in New Jersey and New York City area. So Steve, what was happening there, and what's kind of the implication for the insurance industry?
Yeah, so that obviously is an event that doesn't happen very often in that part of the country. For the insurance industry, it looks to be largely more of a news story than a major event, so not much in the way of property damage. But something for consumers to consider is in their standard homeowners policy, they may not have coverage for earth movement or earthquakes, so something to review with your insurance company, regardless of where you live, because sometimes these events happen in places where you don't expect. So for insurers, largely more of a news story again than a claims event. But just reminds all of us to review our policy and make sure we're covered for the different hazards that could come up.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So the topic for today we want to dive into is the weather. And the weather actually has a large impact on insurance. And we've seen a change in the weather. So Mark, maybe if you could just set the table for us here in terms of what's been happening over the past few years, and then we can kind of dive into the implications.
Yeah, I mean, really, we've seen quite a market shift, I'd say, in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, a lot of it started back in, I think, 2017. It was one of the worst kind of losses on record, just in terms of the volume of losses. And we've really seen, so we often are tracking, a lot of the government websites that are putting together the kind of these major events. And we look at how it impacts customer satisfaction, right? Obviously, it has a big impact on the loss ratios. The industry's really, I think, been suffering over the last, 4 years straight now. They've had about a 104, 105 loss ratio on the homeowner side. And a lot of that's just been because there's been just a huge spike in a lot of these weather events. They started tracking this data over 40 years ago. And, for about 30 years, there was only an average about 5, 6 events. And then it spiked up, like I said, in the last 7, 8 years, we saw a big spike. And for the last 4 years, there's been almost 20 events a year now, right? Averaging about 20, 22 events. So that's a really, sharp rise there, right? A fourfold increase essentially in kind of the norm over history. So that's obviously put a huge strain on insurance companies. Like I said, it's impacting the loss ratios, impacting just I've heard it described a couple different ways where, some carriers have talked about it. There used to be peaks and valleys where now it's just there's constant, activity. I've just recently heard an insurer make a reference to, hey, this is like the death of 1,000 storms is what we just went through last year because there were so many little events. You don't have the big Hurricane Ian and Ida coming through creating, big damage areas. Now it's just you've got a bunch of storms impacting just a broad, area of the country.
Yeah, it's a super interesting trend, and Steve, we know this is especially acute in Florida. I'm in California. We see it kind of from a different angle here in terms of the fire risk and so forth. But what do we see happening in Florida and California, tying back to this change in the trend in weather?
Yeah, that's a good question around specifically those two states. Well, what Mark addressed is really a national trend that has been affecting insurers around the country. It's been a heightened effect, obviously, as we all know, in Florida and California, where different types of weather events, different types of perils have caused just a compounding effect in terms of claims costs. So while all insurers and all consumers in all the different states are dealing with inflationary impacts, we're dealing with in Florida and California the massive increase in just claims frequency and because of the weather, the severity of claims too on the property side, which has caused some insurers to revisit whether they want to continue to offer policies there or whether they want to renew existing policies in those markets. And recently in our list product, we've been tracking closely what insurers are doing in California and Florida, and then how consumers are responding to what insurers are doing. And what we're seeing is that specifically in Florida and California, the fact that insurers are backing out of the market has caused consumers to shop less often for their homeowner's policy. And that affects also, in an indirect way, shopping for auto. So many households, and especially in both of those states, want to bundle auto and home policies together. And if they're concerned that, because they hear from neighbors, from on the news, from friends and family, that those people are having their homeowners insurance policies canceled or non-renewed, and they need to find a new insurer, and then the difficulty they're having finding a new homeowners insurer in those markets is causing those that are saying, well, whether I'm just going to shop for homeowners insurance or I'm considering to shop for both bundled auto and home, maybe now is not a good time to shop because there's so much difficulty in finding a homeowner's policy. So what we're actually seeing is that compared to the rest of the country, where auto insurance shopping really picked up, it spiked in Q1. We're seeing the highest rate of shopping for auto insurance in the history of that list product here in Q1. Whereas in California and Florida, because of the concerns around just the ability to find a homeowner's policy, causing homeowners shopping to drop significantly, and also having an effect on, again, indirectly the auto shopping, because those that want to bundle, the bundled shop rate is down because of the concerns around finding a home policy.
So Mark, this change in trend and catastrophic weather events, is this just a Florida, California thing, or are we seeing this in other parts of the country as well?
Yeah, well, I think Florida and California, certainly in the last few years, they've really had some devastating wildfires. I mean, some of the worst they've ever had, in the history have happened, 2020, 21, very recent history. So I think that stuff gets a lot of the, headline attention. Same with Florida, right? You get a lot of hurricanes coming through. Same with like Louisiana. Those are the ones that get a lot of the notoriety, get a lot of attention around them because there's these large scale events impacting lots of people. But where we're really seeing in terms of the frequency of events, I mean, the Midwest, for example, really has been hit hard the last couple of years. I mean, states like Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, like that core area right there in the Midwest, I mean, they've had the highest frequency in terms of the actual number of events. These big billion-dollar events have really taken place in those Midwest states. So it's really been spread out more because there's just such a large volume, and it's really encompassing a lot more of the country now.
So the insurance carriers can't control the weather, but they can control how they communicate with their policyholders. And we know from our research that one of the key success factors and key drivers of customer satisfaction is when we see a high correlation between policyholders really understanding what they're covered, what's in their coverage, and satisfaction. So, Breanne, how are insurance companies doing here, just in terms of educating their customers and helping them understand what's included in their policy?
Yeah, great question, Mike. It's not so great. About half of insurance customers across auto and home understand their policy or have a complete understanding of their policy. Some might have a partial understanding, but sometimes partial isn't enough, especially if you're dealing with a big weather event, right? It's interesting because I think, the earthquake in New York, luckily, was a fairly, non-event for a lot of people and insurance companies. But I think what it did is it got people talking about their coverage, right, and their policies and what's included. Steve and myself had a conversation about it. And, some people might live on a fault line and not even realize it and might be at risk. And, I think when an event like that happens, that's not as, devastating of an impact. It at least gets people kind of talking and hopefully will help trigger, individuals to maybe reach out to their insurance company. The documentation that come with insurance policies, the auto declaration page, the home declaration page that basically you get when your policy renews, they're pretty convoluted and confusing. And I mean, we've seen some insurance companies do a really good job kind of providing supplementary information to help customers understand that, right? Maybe some visual components kind of breaking things out. But otherwise, a lot of customers aren't reading that documentation either. So, there's a lot of space for the industry to, do a better job there, not just in how the documentation looks and what's available there, but also in having those types of conversations with customers. And then customers have to be their own advocates as well, too, and reach out.
Steve, what about on the insurance agent side? What should insurance agents be doing in terms of doing a better job of helping their customers understand what's in their policy, and if they're looking to switch, how can they help them with that also?
Yeah, Mike, as you know, I really focus on the front end of the business with shopping and new customer acquisition. I think agents play a really critical role there. As Bree mentioned, the most impactful KPI in our auto insurance study and homeowners insurance study. So the thing that most drives an improvement in satisfaction with consumers is the degree to which they understand their policy. In our insurance shopping work, we see that is actually the second most important KPI. So still really important in driving the experience of buying a new policy. And there, when you're buying through an agent, I think a lot of us as consumers trust that the agent is going to look out for our best interests and make sure our insurance covers the needs that we have. And I think agents should take another step back and look at how well they're explaining the policy coverages to a customer. Our data has been saying for over 20 years now very clearly that consumers just don't understand their policies that well. And when you think about what you're buying when you buy insurance, you're buying a promise that should something bad happen, the insurer is going to make it better for you. And you're buying and as Bree was talking about, a 30 or 40 page promise. And those 30 or 40 pages are written in legalese and regulatory language that you can't really understand it as a consumer. So while that promise is something they have a lot of trust in when they're buying through the agent, and the agent makes them feel good about that promise, they don't really understand it. And then in Mark's work, he sees it show up in the claims. So a customer didn't understand what their policy covered and doesn't cover. That can very well lead to a bad claim experience when they didn't understand what the policy covered. So I think our work for over 20 years has made it really clear that this is a clarion call to insurers to make sure you're doing your due diligence to have your customers understand that promise that you're selling them. It is a fairly complicated promise. It can be convoluted in the language, as Bree was saying. And I think it's on us as insurance professionals and everybody at the insurers to own that and make it a better experience for consumers. And while you have to explain things the way that regulations require, an agent can sit down with a customer and explain it more in layman's terms and make that easier to understand. And all in all, that's going to lead to a better relationship with the agency, better relationship with the carrier. And when a claim does happen, more likely to have a better claims experience because the customer understands what's covered and what isn't.
Yeah, just to piggyback on Steve's comment there, since he talked about how important it is, in that moment of truth, right? You're having a claim, avoiding some of those surprises around coverage, or we certainly see it come through in the deductible is always a good example too. When you have these large scale events, these big cat events, you're often paying a percentage of your coverages, as your deductible. So we saw an increase this year. I think that's another byproduct of just this more storm activity. As we saw an increase in customers incurring these higher dollar amount deductibles or incurring out of pocket costs. It was like a 5 percentage point increase. And that's just a very, negative situation, right? We see customer sat drop significantly when those types of surprises happen. And we, one of the top KPIs in our study is around just avoiding, like things not being covered that you expected to be covered, right? Just so part of that is educating the consumers, knowing what's going into this, avoiding some of those surprises. We really see that as a critical piece here. And by and large, I think insurers are doing a good job in terms of, you just look at anybody's social media and there's tons of storm preparedness, warnings, right? Getting like education out there so customers are better prepared facing a storm. They also use it as a great tool to, I think, promote some of their digital offerings. Like, and by the way, you can report this claim, digitally to us, right? Go online, use the app to help expedite this process. But I think another opportunity that we saw in the data is there's often a disconnect getting people into these digital channels that they think it's going to create all these efficiencies and things are going to move around really quickly. Well, often that can't happen in a big, wide scale cat event impacting, everyone's, contacting their insurance company. Resources are stressed with contractors and materials and everything. So things can slow down. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to better set those expectations on what's going to happen when I'm engaging with some of those digital tools as well.
Thanks, Mark. So just to kind of wrap up today, why don't we go around the horn and maybe if we could just offer the people listening to the podcast just a couple of conversation starters, like what kind of questions can they take back to their organization and have in their next meeting when it comes to the impact of the change in the weather and the number of catastrophic events. Steve, why don't you take it from from the acquisition side. Breanne, if you could take it from the servicing side, and then Mark from the claim side. So Steve, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I would say a question I would be if I was at an insurer right now looking at the changes in the weather and what that's doing to our industry. From an acquisition side, I'd say let's take a look at what this is going to do, not just to an overall shopping rate that moves up and down, but who is it going to cause to shop and what are they going to be looking for? And how does that customer want to be serviced? And make sure that we're meeting the customer where they are in terms of we have the products, we have the coverages, we have the service and distribution channels that they want. Because as these events happen in Florida and California, as we mentioned a few moments ago, are great examples of there are some unique conditions in those markets where they're affecting people's shopping and what they're looking for. And some insurers right now are doing very well in those markets. Others are not doing quite as well. So another question I'd think about if I was at an insurer right now when it comes to that is the whole theme that we've been talking about today is does a customer understand their insurance policy? And I think weather is one where we're seeing that problem manifest. 5 years from now, we'll see some other way that problem manifests. But in our 25 years of surveying consumers, that problem's always been there, that the customer just doesn't really understand their policy well enough. So again, if I had the insurer, I'd be asking the team, what can we do that helps the customer understand that promise we sold them in a way that speaks to them in the language and the terms that they're going to understand? Yes, we send out all these documents. We could be saying we're sending out dozens of pages of documents, but look at those documents. An average consumer doesn't understand them. And who's going to sit down and read dozens of pages? It might be that you're over communicating somewhat, right? And that's creating a problem. So I think the insurers that find a way to concisely and clearly communicate what that promise entails, what it covers and what it doesn't cover, and how to think about insurance differently as a consumer are going to be winners in the future.
Yeah, great, Steve. You covered kind of a lot, I think, of what I would mention. I think one of the things too is that if I were working for an insurance company right now, I would really think about, what can we do to get ahead of this, right? Don't wait for a customer to reach out and ask for an explanation of their policy. Try to be proactive about it. We find that when an explanation is given through an agent, having kind of that opportunity to talk about the policy and to, have that back and forth creates, better experience, and customers tend to kind of leave understanding the policy better than, to Steve's point, you're sending lots of documents in the mail, trying to cut through the clutter and figure out what's, relevant. There's a lot that can be lost there. So, as an insurance company, I would really think about what kind of training, do my agents have available to fully understand how to communicate the types of risks in the areas where they're, servicing customers, right? Because there's a lot of variation depending on where you're located in the country. So having that additional, kind of training opportunity and helping agents understand how to explain it, right? Because an agent might understand it, but how do you get that step to ensure that a customer also understands it as well? Because they're not looking at this type of information on a daily basis, right? There's a lot of, like Stephen mentioned, like legalese and stuff involved in these documents, and it probably goes over a lot of customers' heads. So I would say be proactive and really think about how you're explaining the information to customers.
Yeah, and then if you translate some of that to the claim space, just to reiterate, I think the theme here is just how you have those conversations with insureds. Can't underscore how important it is just to be empathetic, right? That's where the soft skills really start to come into play. So it's whether it's revisiting training around how are we having these difficult conversations around those customers, putting it, in positioning it the right way. And I think there's more sensitivity around these coverage and cost type issues because rates are increasing so much, right? Everyone's experiencing rate increases, and then you may have a decision not going your way, and in terms of a high deductible that you may have been surprised by, some coverage issues that we see come through from time to time. I think that's an important one. The other one that I'd always that I always think about is just this staying in tune to what's happening in the process. In terms of the timing of events, we know when there's large areas impacted, the use of independent adjusters may increase. But we often see that slow down the process, right? There's not the same, speed and turnaround than if it's a staff appraiser going out is often what we see in the data. So it's, understanding what some of those impacts are and better preparing the customer. Is it clear what's going to happen if I submit photos, right? How are these being used in the process? What is that going to do to the rest of the timing? So I think there's an opportunity to also better manage expectations around what's going to happen in this claim and how long should things be expected to take. So, getting real dynamic feedback on that and kind of updating expectations, as frequently as possible.
So Steve, Breanne, and Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to thank Carolyn and Dan, our producers, and of course I want to thank our listeners as well. And we'll see you next time.